Hello, everybody. Yeah, welcome. Welcome to another installation of the Crow Canyon webinar series. And we just keep having just incredible speakers. I'm Kyle Basinski. I'm the director of the Research Institute at Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. I want to just give people a little introduction to what we're going to be doing today before I turn it over to our speaker, Ben Bellorado. First, thanks to all of you for being here and thanks for making this possible. It really has been through the support of everybody who's been joining these webinars and through the participation of all of our speakers that we've been able to do this. It's been fantastic. Special thanks, as always, to Dylan Schwint, our director of IT, who, you know, down to the wire can solve technical problems, as Ben knows. We're here. And Taylor Hasbrook, who's been the lead coordinator for these and has been organizing all of our speakers. Thanks to the two of you. For those of you joining today who may not have ever used Zoom, this is Zoom. Most of you are joining us on Zoom. Couple things. First of all, you can see my head talking. It might be in the upper right-hand corner of your screen or somewhere. You can move my head. You can either minimize it, there's a little narrow bar, or you can just click my head and shift it around. So when Ben's talking, you're going to see his head. But if his head is in the way of something important on his screen, move his head or minimize it.
I have a big head.
He's got a big head. I'll also be taking questions during Ben's talk. What we're going to do for this talk is hold all the questions to the end, but you can always ask questions during. I'll just be pulling them all together and then I'll ask them on your behalf at the end of Ben's lecture. You can ask questions in Zoom by clicking the little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see it on your screen and you're on mobile, just tap your screen and it'll show up down there. We prefer you to ask the questions through the Q&A tool as opposed to the chat tool. It's just a little different how it looks on our end. It's easier to deal with on the Q&A. We'll try to get to all your questions. If you're having difficulties, head over to our live stream on Facebook, facebook.com/Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. And if you're really having technical difficulties, Ben's talk tonight will get posted on YouTube in perpetuity. So go on over to our YouTube channel. You can get there easily by crowcanyon.org/YouTube. So a little bit about Crow Canyon for those of you who might be joining us for the first time. Our mission at Crow Canyon is to empower present and future generations by making the human past accessible and relevant through archaeological research, experiential education, and American Indian knowledge. And what you're going to see today in Ben's talk is that Ben and all of our scholars are really able to blend all of those aspects of our mission into the work that they're doing. We've got a couple of important or fun upcoming webinars. Next week, we've got Charles King talking about the historic influences in contemporary Pueblo pottery. And then the week after that, we've got a really special presentation as part of the Four Corners lecture series of a film, Languages of the Landscape. It's on the Cedar Mesa's Perishable Project, or Cedar Mesa Perishables Project, which Lori Webster, who's one of Ben's mentors and an important person for the project Ben will be talking about today. It's a project she's been running looking at perishable items, perishable artifacts in museum collections from the Cedar Mesa area. And it's a long-term project just doing incredible documentation of these important objects. So that's not to be missed. So I want to introduce my good friend and colleague, Dr. Ben Bellorado. And I'll just get it out of the way right now. We're really excited because Ben is soon to be the laboratory manager at Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. He'll be returning to Crow Canyon after about a decade away from us, and we just can't wait. Ben was the lab programs and intern coordinator for Crow Canyon Archaeological Center for several years at the beginning of the millennium. For over 20 years, Ben has studied material cultures in the Southwest of peoples who lived in the Four Corners area. He's originally from Wyoming. He got his BA from Fort Lewis College right over in Durango and his master's degree from Northern Arizona University. And he just received his doctorate this last spring from the University of Arizona. He's worked extensively in the CRM industry and has studied a diversity of topics over his career, ranging from some really influential work in maize agriculture, ceramic analysis, experimental archaeology, and ethnography. Ben's recent research that I'll be talking about today has focused on documenting at-risk archaeological sites in the embattled Bears Ears National Monument, using tree ring dating to date these sites and revisiting old museum collections of ancient clothing. His doctoral research is aimed at understanding the ways that ancestral Pueblo people used textiles and textile depictions in other media to express complex ideas about social identity in the 10th through 13th centuries. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Ben's going to share his, and take it away, Ben. Thank you for being here.
Okay.
All right,
Let's see.
2 seconds. Stop
okay,
share.
I can't do it. Oh, now I can. Okay.
You can do it.
All right, let's see here. Tell me if this is the right one. Share. Does that look like the full presentation?
Hold on, it's coming up. It's coming up. There it is. Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. This is a whole new format for all of us. I've done this a few times, but you know, bear with me. But thanks so much for all the folks at Crow Canyon, Kyle and Taylor, and then Dylan especially. We had some technical difficulties like half an hour ago, but hopefully they're all fixed, worked out. So yeah, thanks for having me. And today the title of my talk is Leaving Footprints in the Ancient Southwest, the Visible Indicators of Group Affiliation and Social Position in the Chaco and Post-Chaco Eras. And I know that's a mouthful, but hopefully it'll all make sense as the presentation proceeds. So today I'm going to be talking about clothing and social identity, and some of the ways that archaeologists can study clothing. And particularly, I'm going to be talking about sandals. And I'm using the northern U.S. Southwest as a case study area to explore the way that ancient Pueblo communities or ancestral Pueblo communities use sandals to express aspects of identities at different scales. And the ways that these expressions change over time, right? That's what archaeologists do, is you look at change over time often. And then also I'm going to be looking at how clothing was used in depictions in other media to help express identities at different scales. And these are some of the places I'm going to be talking about today. You can see the northern Southwest here, the Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, of course, where those places come together. A blown up screen here, these different archaeological regions, or at least as archaeologists define them, different cultural areas. And I'm going to be talking about different sites, and this area kind of is a larger region that I call the greater San Juan River drainage. It's bigger than the San Juan basin. It's the greater San Juan River drainage. Anyway, so without further ado, I'll be introduce some of the theories I'm going to be using. Of course, you know, what is social identity? That's some of the archaeologists, especially in the Southwest, have really been focusing on a lot in the last decade. And it's so what is social identity? Basically, it's the way that we define ourselves and others. It's flexible, it's situational. It can be used passively to reflect identities, or it can be actively signaled. We can express identities at different scales, and it can be materialized through different practices and social behaviors. And it's a continuous interaction between people and things, and these interactions with things especially can leave traces in the archaeological record then that archaeologists can study. And then in terms of visibility and style, what's visibility? Of course, visibility affects the way that messages that we communicate are integrated. You know, high level visibility attributes of artifacts are things that are easier to see. They're messages that are usually actively expressed, so something we call emblemic style, whereas low-level visibility are things that are harder to see. That has to do with what we call communities of practice, or the learning frameworks, the the way you learn how to do something. You don't necessarily think about the way you tie your shoe because you learned how to do that. But, what are the processes in there that help, tell us how you learn these things? That's what we call technological style. And then clothing theory and anthropology of dress are really fascinating theories that I'm going to be talking about. So, clothing, obviously, we all wear clothes, right? Without our clothes, we're these kind of funny looking apes. But when we put on our clothes, we really put on our identities. And really, they're the most personal venues, the most personal materials through which we express our identities. There are these key materials through which society is produced and reproduced. And then dress, as I'm talking about today, is the act of dressing oneself, the habits, the practices of dressing oneself. But they're also signifying systems, right? We can passively or actively express different aspects of our identities with our clothing by putting on these dressing ourselves. And then we can also, of course, mask different parts of our identities. And so, in essence, clothing is this covering oneself in a social skin. Part of clothing theories is a branch called fashion theory, and people often ask, like, how can you study fashion in archaeological record? Well, let me explain really what fashion is. It's a kind of communication. It's a measure of change over time and space at its very essence. So costumes, and then their component garments, and then even just the attributes, kind of the lapels or whatever parts of those garments can fall into two categories in terms of fashion theory. And so we have what we call fixed costumes or anti-fashion, and then modish costumes or fashionable costumes. So fixed costumes are designed to function as a symbol of continuity with the past. They change slowly over time, and they vary greatly across space. And the prime example of fixed costumes are the coronation garments of the Queens of England. So we can see on the upper right here, you can see the coronation outfit of Queen Elizabeth I in 1559. And you can see she's wearing the crown, of course, has a scepter, this badge of office, and this big long cloak lined with fur. And then if we look 400 years later at the coronation gown of Queen Elizabeth II, and of course there are a lot of queens in between those two, we can see that she's basically wearing the exact same clothes, and that's a very intentional thing, right? It's designed to show that she's part of that long line of the British monarchy. And so that's what we call a fixed garment, kind of, at one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, we have modish costumes or fashionable costumes. And these change rapidly in time, and they vary very little across space. Often they're associated with social movements that arise. So, for example, ghost dance shirts. Or we can look at women's march hats. And I'll show you a picture of those in a second. Things that come about with social movements. And in our modern Western society, modish costumes, whether they're associated with social movements or not, are really our thing. What's the look of 2020? Well, the look of 2020 is a little different than normally. So we can see, especially with fashion, how clothing can interact with politics and social movements. And in today's world, fashion is often integrated with these things. So we can look, like I said, the women's march hats on the left, MAGA hats. What are the politics of a hoodie? We've all heard about these things. We don't think about them in terms of, what this might mean, how we might find these things archaeologically about in past societies. And then, of course, right now we're in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic, and I hope you all are safe and doing well. And I appreciate you tuning in to this presentation. But so we, right now we of course see clothing, a new type of clothing coming into fashion, masks, right? It's something that's functional, right? It protects us, protects our everybody around us. But very quickly as this started to happen, we started to use that new facial covering, that new space on our bodies in a political realm. Right, we started putting different political messages up, and so we see this mix of fashion and function. Anyway, so I'm going to be talking about today something a little bit different, but the way we can see that clothing taking on these kind of social and political dimensions and changing over time. And one way we can again look at this is through cross-media approaches. And so archaeologically, we can use our cross-media approaches to study the way that design content can be transferred from one media to the next. How certain social messages can be transferred from one media into a variety of media, and how that tells us how those messages function in that society at that given time. And this helps archaeologists understand the importance, the relative importance of both objects and then the messages in these ancient societies. So again, we have this spectrum. So with cross-media studies, we have pervasive and partitive design systems. So pervasive designs are used to decorate many types of things at once, whereas partitive designs are used to decorate only certain types of things and not others. And a prime example comes from my old professor, Kelly Hayes Gilpin, at Northern Arizona University, and she looked at different types of design systems that were transferred onto multiple media. So we have these certain kind of pottery designs from the Bassmaker 3 era. These what we call Thunderbird designs. And we see that during the Bassmaker 3 period, this particular design system was placed not just on pottery, but also on sandal treads here. You can see in the lower left of this picture, and then also on basketry. And so this was a design system that spread across multiple media. But then there was a partitive design system at the same time. The media of rock art had basically a totally different design system, something that didn't match any of these things. So we can see that certain images had certain importance at that particular time, and that we can see what different media was appropriate to put those designs on. Anyway, so then jumping back to the kind of the focus of the talk, though. I'm going to be talking about the Chaco and the post-Chaco era. So the Chaco era extended from 850 to about 1140 AD, and it was a region-wide system of connected settlements with Chaco Canyon and Pueblo Bonito at its core. You can see where this blue dot is in the center of that map. It's a time when we see the development, clear development of social hierarchies. We see the first regional exchange system of goods in both exotic and mundane. And we see the development of monumental architecture, great houses, great kivas, roadways. And we can see on this map here, all of these, the white dots, the white squares and dots are the extent of these great houses. Well, I should say all the dots. These great houses and great kivas across the greater San Juan River drainage. And then about 1030 to 1140 AD, we see the development of these Chaco outliers. Basically, these kind of smaller versions of Chaco Canyon great houses that occurred, like I said, across the region. And that really, between 1030 and 1140 was really when that that system spread out. Now, the post-Chaco era is extended from about 1140 to 1300, and it's broken up into two time periods. So first we have the McElmo period from 1140 to 1200, and then later the Mesa Verde period. So in the McElmo period, it began with this hallmark, of a region-wide drought. It really affected agricultural production in the area. There was a massive reorganization of the Chaco world, and the Aztec complex in Aztec, New Mexico, up here just north of Chaco Canyon, in northwestern New Mexico, appears to have become kind of the new regional center for the San Juan Basin, or at least for the northern part of the San Juan Basin. And this is also a time we see this revitalization of different Chacoan rituals and performance spaces, the development of new types of traditions and artifact styles, and increasing territoriality. And then, of course, in the Mesa Verde period, we see this shift to canyon-oriented habitations, like cliff dwellings. You can see it's where Tower House here in Mesa Verde is kind of an archetypical cliff dwelling. And then canyon head sites. So we have Sand Canyon, which is a site that Crow Canyon excavated in the 70s and 80s, is one of many of these very large canyon head sites with hundreds of rooms. Then, of course, between about starting about 1250 and extending into the late 1200s, we have this region-wide depopulation. We're basically in the northern part of the Southwest, especially in the northern San Juan. We see basically all these ancestral Pueblo people over time, over about 50 years, moved out of this northern part of the region. Where did they go? They went to Hopi, to Zuni, to the northern Rio Grande, to the Acoma area. But anyway, so the northern Southwest then is this really an ideal case study area to look at clothing. It's a perfect place, especially to study ancient dressing practices and in relation to social identities. We have really good climate. We have arid climates that are great for preservation conditions for textiles. We have alcoves and cave-like rooms. We have some textiles that are made of these really resistant materials like yucca. And then it's also this kind of tumultuous period with a lot of social upheaval and social change between the Chaco and post-Chaco eras. So if there's ever a place and a time in the Southwest when we can look at changing clothing styles and fashions, it would be this Chaco and post-Chaco eras in the northern Southwest. So that being said, though, clothing only rarely preserves in archaeological deposits because it's made out of perishable materials for the most part, right? So often this is what we find. So this is a turkey feather cordage I found a few years ago at a site. Basically, it's yucca cord wrapped in little turkey quill feathers. And so we look at this way, oh, people had a turkey feather blanket or a bird feather blanket. We really don't have a really good concept of what that actually meant, except for in a few cases where we find more fully preserved items. So here we have, this is from Mesa Verde. This is a feather blanket with this really complex design woven in. You can see part of it's intact. This other part right here in the lower right is a little less well preserved. But it gives you kind of a sense of what that entire thing looked like. And so, just based on these little fragments, we know that people had these items, but we don't know, it's hard for us to really reconstruct what these looked like across the region. Did everybody have them? Were they all this complex? It's just hard to say. Fortunately, though, of all the types of textiles that have been used in the ancient Southwest, yucca sandals are the most frequently recovered and the most frequently preserved. So there's been a number of different types of footwear, of yucca sandals in particular, that people in the ancient Southwest used. And today I'm going to be talking about one of those in particular, but here's an overview kind of the different types of sandals. We have plain weave sandals here. These are most common on the left, most common in the Kayenta area in northeastern Arizona. We have these coarse plain weave sandals. And these are really common in the late Pueblo III period, especially at those big cliff dwellings. They're pretty easy to make. I've made the replica in about 5 minutes, but they don't last very long. They kind of fall apart. They're just this really crudely woven over under of these minimally processed yucca leaves. Then we have coarse plaited sandals, and this is the lower surface here. And these are minimally processed yucca leaf elements too that are plaited together, also called twill plaited. And I've seen a friend of mine make a replica of these in about 10 minutes or so, and they last a bit longer than the plain weaves, but they're not very fancy. Then we have second from the right, a little bit fancier or substantially fancier, this fine plated or fine twill plated sandals. And these are, again, yucca leaf elements that are minimally processed, but a little more processed in the coarse sleeve. And then on the right here, we have what we call twine sandals. And these are the most complexly woven textiles ever produced in the northern Southwest. And I'm going to be talking a lot more about these as we go. So how do we study twine sandals in archaeological record of the northern Southwest? Well, I took a multifaceted approach. I conducted a technological and stylistic or emblematic analysis of attributes of twine sandals. And then I also conducted a cross-media analysis of clothing and clothing imagery, particularly of sandals from building murals, rock art, and portable objects. And then I actually conducted a dating study as well, where I AMS dated 14 Twine Sandals. That's accelerator mass spectrometry. It's a fancy, really precise type of radiocarbon dating. And then also I conducted tree ring dating of structures that had sandals depicted in plaster murals. And so basically I dated the structures that that had these depictions. And then I looked at a relative dating framework of rock art and pottery designs with sandal motifs. And these are all designed to basically get at 5 major research questions involved related to production, cross-media comparisons, distribution, and then consumption and use of sandals. So I wanted to look at, how were sandals made? Were they made the same ways in all these communities across the region, or did certain communities specialize in different types of techniques? How did sandal production change over time? And then how similar were the actual depictions of sandals to, or the actual sandals to the depictions in other media, I should say? How similar were they? How did they get distributed? How, what was the scale of the distribution of sandals? And did they show up in the same types of places? How were they used? And then finally, what types of identities did they relate or they used to express? So to get into that, I'll talk about just real briefly the history of twine sandals over time. And you can see that they were, in that definition of fashion, we can see they were really a fixed garment. Probably they were made for over 1,000 years in the northern Southwest, from about 8100 or so in the late Bassmaker II era, all the way until about 1300 AD. And we can see that over time here, you can see this arrow of change over time. You can see that they did change somewhat. They had basically the same type of construction techniques, more or less. Excuse me. But then over time, we can see especially their toes and the heel shapes definitely changed a lot over this time period. And I won't go into that too much because I really want to focus just on this Chaco and post-Chaco eras. So basically in the post-Chaco or Chaco and post-Chaco era, we have, again, these are some of the most complex textiles ever made. Each one is made from finely woven yucca yarns. No two pair are exactly alike. They have contoured toe shapes. They often have these little nubs on the outside of the foot we call toe jogs. And then they often have 2 colors, natural and then usually a brown or some other color. And then they have these raised treads, I'll talk about more in a second. And so they would have left really unique footprints when worn in soft soil, which is one of the coolest parts of these sandals. So in the Twine Sandal Analysis, I compiled a data set of 284 sandals from this post-Chaco era. There's a lot more from the Bassmaker era, probably some from the P1 era that we don't really know what those look like, but there's 284 that I looked at. And I visited 16 museums and curation facilities, including American Museum of Natural History, the Smithsonian, the Field Museum in Chicago, and a number of other local museums like Edge of the Cedars, the Canyon of the Ancients Visitor Center Museum just north of Crow Canyon, and Arizona State Museum, and among others. And then, as Kyle mentioned, my mentor in the textile analysis is Dr. Lori Webster. She lives right in Memphis, Colorado there. Just incredibly knowledgeable and such a great mentor. So she and I in 2016 went to the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and she showed me how to basically analyze these sandals. And then she and I developed these methodologies that I used in my dissertation to kind of take to these other places. So I ended up going, as I said, 16 different museums. And this research was really funded primarily from a grant from the National Science Foundation that allowed me to go to these museums. And I'm incredibly grateful for that. So I looked at a number of different attributes of different visibility. So I looked at low visibility attributes like the weave structure, the toe shaping, the heel finish, and other attributes so you could a little easier to see, like the raised treads design elements. How did they make those, and what were the designs? And then high visibility things, so the color, the shape, how the tie loops were put together. And I basically compiled these data sets from sandals that were in these collections. Some of them had been excavated by the Wetherills or from Alfred Kidder, over 100 years ago, and they've basically been sitting in these museums, and very few people have come to look at them, and nobody's conducted this region-wide synthesis, which is what I really wanted to do. So I looked at sandals from all over, from Pueblo Bonito and Chaco Canyon, Aztec West ruins, I should say, in the Middle San Juan, Canyon de Che, Antelope House, and Canyon de Che, and Canyon del Muerto, that general area in northwestern New Mexico, or sorry, northeastern Arizona, and other sites in northeastern Arizona that, like I said, Kidder had looked at, sites from in Mesa Verde and other parts of southwestern Colorado, and then a number of sites in southeastern Utah, smaller cliff dwellings. Like I said, I radiocarbon dated with AMS dating 14 twine sandals. I was able to get permission to do this. And then the great folks at the University of Arizona AMS lab helped me process these dates. And basically, I came up with two different clusters, is what the dating came up with, two different clusters of dates. So we see one cluster here in the Chaco era. Basically, they're more precise than regular radiocarbon dates, but they still have a range. And so these range from about the late 900s, really right about the early 1000s to the mid 1100s. And then there was a second cluster that was in the late 1100s and 1200s. And this helped me kind of lock in when certain attributes of these sandals were made and used, right? And it helped me kind of look at change over time. Then I also looked at the contextual information available for about half of the sandals, so we could tell, like, they're from room 25 at Pueblo Bonito, and so we know what construction event that room was made in, and then roughly, when those deposits that these were recovered from, what those dated to too. And so I was able to reconstruct that for about half of the sandals and kind of put them in this seriation. So you can see there's just a few sandals dated to this early part of the Chaco era. And then I had this really big peak from Aztec West ruins and Antelope House in Canyon de Che, in Canyon del Muerto, that dated from this 1085 to 1140 period. And then a number of sandals from the Mesa Verde, or Micomo and Mesa Verde phases, basically after 1140. And then there was, of course, a number that just didn't date. And based on my stylistic analysis, I think I can actually kind of assign those relatively to some dating frameworks now, but that'll be the next talk. So I want to tell you how cool these things were. I said that the most complexly woven sandals ever, or sort of textiles really ever made in the Southwest. And so I'll tell you, each one of them has about 110 feet of really finely plied yucca yarns, really, really tiny yarns, 110 feet each one. So that's about 23 feet of warp yarn. So you get the vertical structure here, or the warps. It's about 23 feet in each sandal. And then there's about 90 feet of these weft yarns go back and forth, weaving it together. And we don't know a whole lot about their actual, the way they're woven, other than looking at the finished objects. We don't know a lot about the process, because there's only been one of these twine sandals that's ever been found in the process of production. And this is a picture of it here on the upper right. It's a sandal production bundle that was recovered from Antelope House. This is the only one of its kind. We have a lot of sandals of other styles in the process of production. This is the only one of these. So it's in this bundle, and it's really interesting. So you can see right in the center, there's this sandal here. It's unfinished. It's mostly finished, but just the heel isn't quite finished. And there's a big bundle of warp yarns here, a bunch of skein of warp yarns, and then a bunch of skeins on the backside of the weft yarns of different colors. And so I did, without taking it apart, of course, I did some analysis with my fabric tape measure, basically mirrored the coil of the warp yarn. Figured out that there was about 87 feet of warp yarns right here, and that's about 4 sandals worth. And then there were 4 skeins of really finely plied weft yarns, and they're so fine and they were so bunched together, I really couldn't get a good assessment of how long, how much yarn was there. But then what that tells us is that it was really important is that they actually made the yarns ahead of time. Instead of making the yarn as they went, when they're weaving, which I think might actually have been easier, they actually made these different color yarns ahead of time, and then they would substitute different colors as they went. And like I said, there's this unfinished sandal here, finished except for the heel. But you can see it has these little raised tread bumps. Actually has a toe jog here, but just incredibly, just a really, really cool object, one of a kind. So then I looked at the warps and the wefts. So you can see often in these other sandals, there's little frayed pieces. So you can actually look at how they were produced. We can look at the spin direction, the number of yarns plied together to make these warps and wefts. And I found it was really homogeneous throughout the entire region. We can see that primarily it was the warps are primarily made it as 3ZS, basically as a final S twist. So it's 3ZS right here. 73% of the sandals were made that way. And then about 20% were made with a 2ZS, so still the final S twist. And that tells us that, they were really uniformly made throughout this region. Basically, everybody started at that very basic level. We're making these sandals in the same way. They spun their yarn in the same directions. And the same with the weft yarns. 95, almost 96% of all the sandals had this 2ZS warp, wefts. So again, that tells us at a very basic level, there's a shared knowledge of how to make these sandals across the region. I looked at another really interesting attribute is the other end of the production, at the end of the production, how the heel was finished. Basically, they're woven from the toe down to the heel, and then they finish with the heel. And nobody had ever looked at the heel finishes of sandals in this time period. And what I found is that there's basically 4 primary ways that they were finished. And that over time, this was a really interesting change. So we can see in the Chaco era here, there was a variety of ways that these heel finishes were produced. And some of them were only produced, it looks like maybe at 1 or 2 communities. So Antelope House had its own variety that shows up primarily at that site. And then in a few assemblages, we see sandals that have those heel finishes in other places. But you never see those at Aztec West. At Aztec West, they had their own style, which really looks very similar until you look at the really fine knit, how they were making them. And basically is kind of the opposite, where basically we don't really see very many of those in the Canyon de Chelly collections. But then, so that's in the Chaco era. So it seems like there's a variety, a number of different groups maybe are making these. And this is one of the ways they kind of sign their wares, either intentionally or unintentionally. But then in the post-Chaco era, there's this bottlenecking of techniques. And basically we go from having these 5 or more different techniques down to just really one style, which is this vertical wrapped twining here. And it's very distinct from these earlier styles. And so, that tells us there's this kind of homogenization over time, where we go from maybe more variety, more innovation is possible. People are expressing their identities in different ways, to really just this kind of very streamlined method of doing it. We can look at the raised treads. Like I said, that's one of my really favorite parts of these sandals. I looked at across these different regions, there was certain communities definitely preferred certain tread designs. And again, like I said, when you walked in soft soil, these would have left certain footprints. And basically what it looks like is certain communities really specialized in those particular designs. So when you saw somebody's footprints who was wearing a twine sandal, you would know right off the bat probably what community they came from across the region, which is really, really cool, right? We can't do that with very many other types of artifacts. So for example, in the Middle San Juan, especially Aztec West, this isolated shape design was the most, by far and large, the most common design. Then in southeastern Utah, these diagonally oriented designs were much more common. And then in Canyon del Muerto and Canyon de Chelly, these columns of raised dots were much more common. But you can see, you know, so like I said, those are probably the local design styles, if you will. The way people identified their local communities, at least to some extent. But then there's a bunch of others. So we can see, especially with this this dark blue here, this is what I call the Rectilinear Scrolls. And these show up not as frequently, but relatively frequently in all these different collections or assemblages from the different parts of the area, different parts of the region. And what I think those might have been is a certain maybe sodality or religious group that had membership that cross-cut lineages, that cross-cut these communities. Basically, people went out, and that seems also particularly common at Aztec West. And I think that what I'm thinking is that might have been kind of the home community for that group, but that they had members, or at least the sandals went out, whether it's people wearing the sandals or the sandals getting given to certain people. They were marking that connection, those networks, with these tread designs. And then there's some one-offs too, where there's just a few sandals in these different assemblages that maybe come from these other places. And I think what these are maybe people marrying into the community, or you know, they're being traded in, or they're coming in, being maybe recruited. If they're part of certain religious groups. And we know that happens in modern Pueblo societies, where groups are invited in. And I think that's potentially how we could explain these lower frequencies. So really, you know, like I said, if you looked across the region and saw somebody's footprints who was wearing a twine sandal, you'd have a pretty good idea of the different either homelands where they came from, or certain really fundamental groups that they belong to, just by looking at their footprints, which is really cool. Another really important attribute that people are really fascinated by in the Southwest are these toe jogs, right? A lot of people talk about the toe jogs. What does it mean? Well, Patty Crown and some of her colleagues at UNM, University of Mexico, a couple of years ago, put out this great article that looked at polydactyly, which is this genetic condition that certain people had in the Southwest. It's actually, you know, we have it still in the modern era. But in the Southwest, we know that a certain lineage that probably was one of the founding lineages of Chaco Canyon, and was this one of the primary lineages of Pueblo Bonito. Several of its members had this condition of polydactyly, and basically they had a sixth toe on the outside of their foot. So you can see this depiction over here on the left, showing somebody with somebody's foot here. So several members of this important lineage had this condition. Seems like most of those folks lived in about 80 in the 800s, the early kind of occupation of the area, or of Chaco Canyon. But that over time, that condition was rare, but did show up. What Patty Crown and her colleagues suggest is that this sixth toe is these toe jogs are basically a symbolic sixth toe. Not that everybody had this condition, but by adding this little jog to the outside of their sandal, they could connect with the, you know, either in reality or fictively with this early lineage at Chaco Canyon, at Pueblo Bonito. Basically they can connect with these ancestors, whether it was a direct connection or by association, by adding this attribute. And this is one of the kind of the hallmarks that Polly Shaftsma, another scholar in the area, has suggested, you know, became an icon of Chaco and Mesa Verde identities, this toe jog. So I looked at the way that toe jogs were made on these sandals, and you can see there's a number of different ways that they were added. And we can see on when they were added over time. And even though those folks with polydactyly probably lived in the 800s, this is an attribute that didn't show up on the sandals till much later. So what I found is that contoured toes, basically this toe shaping, started in about the mid 1000s, but then the toe jog itself didn't really pick up until about 1085 to 1140. So in this, we call the late Bonito phase. And that's when we see this, you know, the massive expansion of the great houses. And so one thought is that that basically became this icon of this Chaco expansion, and then eventually this kind of Chaco revitalization that we see in the post-Chaco era. So you can see by the late Bonito phase and then into the McElmo and Mesa Verde phases, the toe jog really takes over, especially in the East. But then it's important to notice that not all of these toe jogs were made in the same way. So people might have seen them and copied the idea, like, oh, we want to connect with that, we want to tie into that political or social movement, but they weren't necessarily all making those attributes in the same methods. And it doesn't look like it actually was accepted everywhere in the northern Southwest equally. So here you can see this is a bunch of pie charts on the map. You can see at Aztec West in particular, 81% of the Twine Sandals had these toe jogs. But as we go around the region counterclockwise, you can see that frequency diminishes. And so you can see in Southwest Colorado, only about 73% had them. And then as we go into Southeast Utah and Northeastern Arizona, we see a reduction to about 30 to 40% that had these toe jogs. So not everybody seems to have bought into that idea, whatever that was, tying in with those, potentially tying with those ancestors that started the Chaco system. Not everybody wanted to tie into that. So that's really interesting. And then one of the last things I'll talk about with terms of the attributes of the sandals is that the tie systems are really important, it seems, for demarking that the individual was actually wearing a twine sandal. So we can see that prior to 1085, again, most people or most of these twine sandals had yucca cordage as a tie, in the tie system. So basically the straps are made out of yucca. And if we think about the tie systems, they're really the most visible thing. When you're wearing a sandal, you're covering most of it up with your foot. So it's hard to see those other attributes as much, other than their footprints as they walk away. So really, that would have been a really important signal of somebody's wearing sandals. And then as we see in the post-Chaco era, there's this reduction, or this, again, a kind of a bottlenecking, if you will. We see the development of new styles of tie systems, some made out of leather here, or buckskin. And those ended up only decorating twine sandals. The other types of sandals I talked about a little bit earlier they never used these buckskin systems or these straps. So just looking at somebody's foot with a sandal, if their straps were made out of buckskin, you'd know right off the bat they were wearing a twine sandal as opposed to some other style. We also see some other really fancy ties made out of square braided cotton cordage. And of course, cotton was, especially in the Chaco and post-Chaco eras, one of the most expensive materials that people had access to. So, I didn't use them on everything. And in twine sandals, I used them to, tie their shoes on. And then a really important thing in terms of looking at attribute in terms of trying to understand who owned these sandals is by looking at their sizes. And this is, of course, one of the basic measurements I looked at. Just measure the length, right? And as I started to measure more and more of these sandals, I kept getting this measurement of just plus or minus 1 centimeter off of 26 centimeters long. And they're really, really uniform. I did a little bit of statistical analysis. And you can see that there's a regional mean of 25.8, so just shy of 26 centimeters. And they're very, very uniform across the region. Based on previous studies, archaeologists have looked at the size of footwear and determined that a measurement of 19.5 centimeters is roughly how you distinguish between adult and subadult size footwear. So anything that's above 19.5 centimeters is basically for an adult. And these were much larger than that 19.5. They were, like I said, about 26 centimeters long. And that was really uniform across the region. The other types of sandals that were easier to make were made in a range of sizes, from children's to subadult to adult. But these twine sandals were really only almost exclusively made for adults. And then if we look at, across the world, who has the largest feet in any community. It's usually adult men. And twine sandals were regularly several centimeters larger than the average sizes of all the other types of sandals, even the adult sizes. And that, again, that also suggests that they were not just for adults, but adult males, potentially. Then looking at their wear and their repair patterns, I found that most of these sandals are really, really worn out. You can see there's a few, so I basically categorize these from slight wear all the way through heavy wear and exhausted. Some of these you probably have to tie on your feet, almost with duct tape to keep them on at the end of their use. People kept using them after they're substantially worn out. And then a few were actually repaired with either leather patches or even old pieces of other twine sandals stitched onto the bottom. And this tells us they were worn even after, by our standards, they were totally worn out. And that suggests, again, that they were really important for people. And you probably couldn't necessarily get a new one. They were so expensive to make, so hard to make. You probably maybe only got one set in your entire life. And then even after they were, had holes worn in the heels and stuff, they were continued to be used. Based on certain attributes, I won't go into it too much, but it looks like they were probably really meant primarily be used in smaller spaces, performance spaces, where you would have been able to see, especially the raised tread designs, but then also some of the other attributes. Probably the most commonly used in either small kivas or court kivas, or in certain portions of great kivas, where you would have been able to see people's feet and their footprints. And they were most often recovered from either small structures, small kivas in the post-Chaco era, or in the prior Chaco era, from rooms associated with court kivas. So they were basically probably ritual storage rooms for ritual paraphernalia. We look at across media comparisons. You can see that some of the most common designs we see on pottery that the region is famous for actually may have been derived from sandal designs. So we can see over here on the left, these different raised tread designs are identified in a number of different sandals, actually have basically these same basic design elements that we see on pottery. So what we call the dripping line motif, really common in the Pueblo II period. Cylinder jars from Chaco Canyon often have these hatched triangles, stacked triangles, really similar to the isolated shape motif we see particularly from Aztec West. Other types of cylinder jars have this dagoji style, these hatcher designs, these interlocking rectilinear scrolls with triangular barbs. That's something that's really common on some of these sandals. And then in the Pueblo III period, we see these bigger, thicker, diagonally oriented elements that we see in a lot of the pottery. So, for example, here's a sandal from Mesa Verde National Park here that I AMS dated at a confidence, 68% confidence. It was made between about 1224 to 1265. Well, that's nearly identical design and very similar time frame to when we see the McElmo and the McElmo Mesa Verde black and white pottery. This is a bowl also from Mesa Verde. And you can see how similar those designs are. So again, it looks like potentially sandal designs may have been transferred onto pottery. There's other types of artifacts that have similar design systems, especially with the color designs. We can see some of these fanciest of the twine sandals. These are trichrome, 3 colors. There's not very many of these, but they have what we call a Sinawa Salado design system. And we see that show up on painted clay-coated baskets, painted stone mortars, painted wood, and then even some black and white pottery designs. These are all particular. All these are from Great House context. We see not just the design system, but also the image of the sandals starts to show up, especially in the after about 1085 in that late Bonito phase, and then into the Mesa Verde time period. We see clay impressed tablets. This is the only one, but it's a sandal was impressed into wet clay. It was itself in the shape of a sandal, and that preserved the design here. There's wooden sandal forms, basically carved and ground in the shape of a sandal, and then some of them are actually painted very similarly to actually the designs we see on these sandals. There's a couple shaped sherds, and then of course these what are called sandal lasts, these ground stone objects that are in the shape of sandals, and these are really common throughout especially the northern San Juan, but other parts of the region as well. So sandals were definitely on people's mind. There's very few that show up on pottery. These are the only 9 that I was able to find. But you can see they show up in the bottom of these bowls, which is really interesting. There's some neat connotations there I'm not gonna be able to get into today. But they're really rare, but they do show up infrequently on pottery designs. And then the final components of my analysis was I conducted a documentation project in southeastern Utah in the Bears Ears area. Basically, I went to all these sites that we see on in the red dots here, and took tree ring samples from structures that had sandal designs either in plaster or paint on walls or in kiva. So you can see here some inscribed decorations that show sandals. Often these show up on the inside of kivas, where we see either sandal depictions and or other types of textile designs made inside of these structures. And we know that they were weaving in these structures because we see loom anchors. These are basically, this is what a loom would have looked like, basically suspended from the roof and the floor, and people would have woven cotton blankets, not necessarily sandals, but because they're showing textiles of a variety of kinds, we think they're probably making twine sandals and other things in those structures. So I did a big survey and found that there was several different ways people were making murals, and one of the main ways produced these incised designs with sandal designs. I conducted tree ring analyses of these beams in these structures, and we were able to determine when they were made, when the structures were made, and therefore when the actual designs were created as well. And so here's a seriation of the different structures that have mural decorations, basically that extend from about 1150 to right before 1300, just in southeastern Utah. Of course, there's many others in the larger region. This is just in southeast Utah. And then I color coded where the different types of murals were, and then arranged those by the style of mural. And what we can see is that created a really cool seriation of when these different styles of murals were created. Now, the sandals themselves that we're talking about pretty much only show up in this narrow window from the early 1200s till about the mid 1200s. You can narrow that down right there, and you can see this box right here shows when these sandal depictions show up, primarily right there. The final component of this, I looked at rock art. And of course, hopefully some of my friends that helped me with this project are tuning in, because I had a ton of help with that tree ring dating project. But then also with sandal rock art, I had folks telling me about sites that they'd seen with sandal rock art. And I was able to compile a database of 520 separate depictions. And actually that number is going up all the time. But sandals were made in rock art a number of different ways. But we can see that they also, like the murals, match really precisely with the actual details of these twine sandals. So here's a really cool pair of sandals, basically drawn, if you will, really quickly on the inside of an alcove face in Grand Gulch, and those match nearly identical this set of designs on the raised treads from a Sandal Aztec West. And we can see that both rock art and building murals, other types of attributes, like especially the toe jog, show up really frequently. So it looks like they were really intentionally making these depictions of to show twine sandals. So in terms of the distribution, we can see these yellow dots across the region. These are all sites where sandal imagery occurs. Excuse me. And there's a cluster in Chaco Canyon, a smaller cluster, and then a larger cluster in southeastern Utah, kind of each itself broken up into 3 clusters, right around Comb Ridge, on Cedar Mesa, and then up and down the Colorado and San Juan rivers, which is really interesting. This is they particularly show up at the mouths of major drainages on big boulders or cliff faces, and up and down here. And this is basically the border between the Kayenta region and the western Mesa Verde region. And this is a really kind of classic distribution, what we might expect for territory marking devices. Basically, you put these, these identifying symbols, these really emblematic symbols of your group right at the major junctions of the major routes of travel. And that suggests that, potentially these, especially in the post-Chaco era, were meant to define territories, basically mark certain resources or the routes into certain places. But one really important thing to look at is, so look here, you see the mouth of Trachyte Creek, or the Smith Fork Bar actually is the largest concentration of sandal imagery. What's the attribute that really stands out? In particular, it's the toe shape, right? So you have this contoured toe with a toe jog. We see that all over in this panel. And then we see that also in Pueblo Bonito again, right? I talked about that in Chaco Canyon, in Pueblo Bonito, but then imagery throughout Chaco Canyon with sandals, we see this toe jog and even raised tread designs depicted as well. Well, that tells us that that symbol really, or that attribute really probably came to represent this some kind of shared identity or ideology that as the crow flies, we can see that's 185 miles from Chaco Canyon at the very furthest extent of where we see sandal imagery in the Four Corners area on the Colorado River. People were drawing sandals with those attributes. So that really tells us about, there's some type of shared identity across this big region that's somehow linked with Chaco Canyon. Like I said, they show up at major routes of travel. I won't go into this too much, but often where we see pecked hand-toe steps going over places like Comb Ridge, we'll see these paired sandal depictions. So like I said, this really speaks to some form of shared identity after, and we can date it relatively based on when those toe jogs show up in the actual sandals, so after the mid-1000s, but then really they seem to explode in the late 1100s, early 1200s. So that potentially that's most likely when this rock art dates to. Of course, it's really hard to date rock art, but stylistic comparisons, we can get pretty close. So it looks like in the 1200s, there was this, it was really important to depict your shoes, especially this particular style of shoes, as identity markers. And you can see they show up in prominent places. This is my godfather, Uncle Bob, on a river trip standing next to a boulder right at this mouth of this major drainage up in the Cedar Mesa. So they were meant to be seen. So then if we step out, the last thing I'll tell you about here is we step back and look at not just sandals, we can look at similar types of emblematic imagery, especially in rock art or murals that we see in other parts of the region. And around the 1200s, if you look to the south, we can see that there was cotton blankets. They, of course, were also very complexly woven, but they're actually much larger and much easier to see. And it seems like people in the Kayenta area, in particular in northeastern Arizona, seems to have latched on to that particular symbol as their emblematic design, the thing that defined their communities. And then if we look over into the eastern or central and eastern Mesa Verde regions around Cortez, so Crow Canyon would be right about here, we can see that basket imagery doesn't really show up so much in rock art, but my colleague Scott Ortman has done incredible work looking at basketry imagery being transposed onto painted pottery, especially Mesa Verde black and white pottery. So you can see some of the similarities here that he points out. So what it looks like, especially in the 1200s, like I said, this post-Chaco era was a time of increasing territoriality. Well, it looks like, at least to some extent, and at certain times, people in these different portions of the region, different territories, use these different types of textiles as basically the symbol of their particular communities. And they were meant to be seen, they were meant to be understood, both internally within those communities and then for other groups as well. So I think I'm just about out of time, so I won't really go into too many, revamp all these conclusions. Maybe I'll just stop here and then we can take some questions. So before I end, I just have a lot of folks I gotta give a little bit of a shout out to. Folks at University of Arizona, my dissertation committee, folks at BLM that I worked with, all of the great curation managers, collections managers, curators, folks at all the museums I went to. And then, of course, the National Science Foundation, and then Canyonlands Natural History Association funded all the dissertation work in southeastern Utah. And then, of course, I had a number of volunteers, about 45 different volunteers. I work in southeastern Utah. So I have to give a big shout out to all those folks. I'm sure I'm forgetting to mention specifics, but I'll just stop there and maybe take some questions. All right, thanks. See if I can figure out how to end the...
Thanks, Ben. I adore this research, as you know. And
Thanks.
it was just great to see it in long form too. It was really, really good stuff. We got loads of questions, but my favorite one is the sort of most softball one. You know, I saw you give one of your earliest presentations on this, I think in 2011 or 2012. We were at the Pecos conference on the north rim of the Grand Canyon. It was a while ago. And even then you were really enthusiastic about it. And somebody asked, you know, what drew you to sandals in the first place? And I realized I don't know the answer to that. What drew you to sandals?
Well, you know, yeah, that's a good question. And I kind of present this research backwards in terms of how it actually came about, but that's just the way it should go, I guess. So, you know, I used to be, or I still am very interested in agriculture, but I was working I was a crew chief on the Comb Ridge Survey Project back in 04 to 06, I think it was. And I adore southeastern Utah. That's what got me interested in archaeology. And I was working this dream job, and we were documenting all these sites up and down Comb Ridge, this really extensive survey. And we kept coming across sandal rock art. And I thought it was really cool, but, you know, I didn't think much of it. And I knew enough at the time, you know, this was 15 years ago. I knew enough at the time to know that was unusual, that there was more than you normally see, but I didn't have enough of kind of an understanding or experience to understand how cool it was. And so I kind of just kept it on the back of my mind. And then I was helping my good friend Tom Wines. He's a fixture in the Southwest, and he's done a ton of tree ring dendroarchaeology work in southeastern Utah. He's focused more on just, you know, looking at the date ranges, taking samples from all the different beams and just to establish dates. And we were working at a site in Natural Bridges, and we went into this kiva, and there was all these incised textiles and incised sandal designs. And it just kind of clicked in my brain again, kind of just, you know, file something away. I was like, oh, that's cool. There's all these sandal depictions in there. And it took me a little while. I was like, wait a second, you could maybe date the sandal images by looking at the tree ring dates. You know, you could date the images in that kiva, and then I could maybe transfer that onto the rock art I've been seeing. Okay, that's cool. And then, so I was like, well, okay, that's one kiva. Well, maybe there's another kiva that has it. And I found another kiva that had similar designs. And then it kind of just precipitated from there. And so I went back to school and I said, hey, you know, I want to try to do this tree ring dating project. And maybe I'll look at a few sandals as well to see if they match up. And then it kind of took off from there, and I got this NSF grant to go look at all the sandals, and then great funding from the Canyonlands Natural History Association to look at all these murals, and it kind of just built that way. So, like I said, it kind of happened the opposite of the way I presented it here, but it was so interesting and so much fun, and you know, even a lot of the work I do, you know, I have a great appreciation for all my colleagues who do just incredible studies. You know, I got my start doing ceramic analysis for Animus Ceramic Consulting for Lori now Stevens. She works at Aztec now. And so I really have a strong foothold in design analysis and sandal analysis, or sorry, ceramic analysis. But I always thought, there's all these colleagues, they do such amazing work. Like, I don't know if I'd want to compete with them by also doing ceramic analysis. So I've always kind of found these other cool things that nobody's doing. And I was just so surprised, like nobody had looked at these sandals before. Nobody had looked at this sandal imagery. So that's kind of how I got into it.
Yeah, it's great that, by the end of your presentation, you were able to bring it back to those original questions, connecting the different types, the different media, and being able to use them in really interesting ways. I love it. You started off talking about communities of practice, the different types of costume or clothing that people wear, fashion. Something about communities of practice is that, oftentimes you're able to identify those communities through the construction of these objects. And I know you weren't deconstructing the objects, but do you think that there were just specialists who were making these sandals that within communities, or do you think it was a household community of practice where households would produce their own sandals?
That's a good question. I think that there were specialists. These things, like I said, they're the most complex. They have, between 15 and 25 different weave structures in each one. Mm-hmm. And that's why I say they're the most complex, and they're so expensive to make. But then they are very uniformly made. Mm-hmm. So if it was just individual households making them, we would expect much greater breadth of variation. But since they are so specialized and they're so uniform, it seems like there are some very kind of formal methods of learning how to do them, and then accepted ways of making them. So I talked about the heel finish in particular. There was some variation in the Chaco era, but there's only 5 or so different versions of how to make those heel finishes. And we see those repeat, they show up across the region, but primarily in certain communities. So like I said, Antelope House had the biggest assemblage, but I think it was 3/4 or so of those sandals had this one particular heel finish. You go to Aztec West, it was kind of this opposite with a different style. And so, even though there is some variation, they're so uniform that I think it really speaks to them being produced by specialists, and because they're so expensive to make. And then I didn't get to speak about the didn't have time to talk about the way the color designs were integrated. Those are really specialized techniques that actually show up primarily on cotton textiles. Mm-hmm. And there was even fewer ways of making, or only a few ways of making those that show up in the twine sandals. So it tells us there were probably specialist weavers that knew how to make do those certain techniques to make the color design show up. So, but yeah, so I think, it's specialized probably groups at these particular sites, and then maybe even certain communities specialized in making them. Probably Antelope House in particular, and then Aztec West as well. And there were probably some others that we just don't have a tight enough grasp on. There's a lot of sample bias inherent in perishable design or perishable analysis, because things just don't preserve. We have this really very specific window at certain sites where these things preserve, but they're probably made a number of other places, and we just don't have the preservation.
Right. Has anybody done any analyses of the pigment that are in the colors?
No, not
where they
yet.
Might be from? Okay.
No, not yet, but that's something that somebody should do. A good friend of mine, Kelsey Hansen, is doing pigment analysis here at U of A, and I've definitely given her a little bit of a nudge, like, hey, we can work together on this. But no, that's a great idea for a future study.
Wow. So what happens after Pueblo 3? Do people continue to wear sandals in the Northern Rio Grande at Hopi? And then what about footwear?
Slide I had on that. No, that's a great question. Yeah, sorry. So no, that's really interesting. So it looks like at the end of the Pueblo 3 period, that post Chaco era, basically right at the end, we start to see more moccasins, and nobody has really done a systematic, or at least a synthetic analysis of moccasins in the late Pueblo, or in the Pueblo III period. But we start to see a few, and in the collections I looked at, you start to see, okay, and we actually see there's some leather sandals that start showing up more frequently. But it looks like twine sandals in particular, the latest dates I have are from about the 1260s, 1270s at the latest, but it seems like their production really diminishes in basically the after 1250, and then they stop being produced. Yucca sandals in general persist a little bit longer, but as soon as the regional depopulation kicks off, it seems like sandals really are one of those things that Bill Lipe had a great thing. What is it? Lost in translation. And there's certain attributes like kiva jars and mugs that don't seem to show up in these places where people end up. Right. Yeah, they don't make the trip. And sandals really seem to be one of those things. So when people got to the Rio Grande, to Hopi, to Zuni, really quickly they stopped making yucca sandals and instead used moccasins. There's one style that shows up till about 1350. We call the H-strap sandal. You see it at Homology and sites like that. But then by about 1350, at least in the northern Southwest, yucca sandals just fall off the radar in favor of moccasins, which is something that's really, really cool. And I think, that might have something to do with how fancy, especially these twine sandals were. Actually, they're probably used by maybe for prestige. They're associated with prestige and certain maybe types of rituals or social hierarchy. And we see that, in the end of the Pueblo III into the Pueblo IV period, this really kind of just real smoothing out of the social hierarchy. So by the time we get into the Pueblo IV period, people say, outwardly, you probably wouldn't have been able to tell like the high priests and the caciques from just the everyday folks living at these sites based on their clothing, based on the types of objects they had just in their regular household. And so this might be kind of a resistance movement, or kind of a response to the kind of the burgeoning hierarchies we saw in the Chaco and post-Chaco eras. In that next time frame, people are really pushing that away and say, no, we don't want to be associated with those that social ladder anymore. We're cutting that out.
It's fascinating to think about the types of material culture that make the trip and the types that don't.
Right.
For example, we think that people were farming in much the same way once they moved down to the northern Rio Grande until they started doing floodplain farming and irrigation. But
right.
Do you see any evidence of raised treads designs? Even if sandals don't make the trip, do you ever get raised? I don't know how you do it, raised tread.
No, I mean you could. No. Well, so like a couple of there's the fine plaited sandals. There's this technique called pseudo embroidery, and you can basically go through afterwards. It's like embroidery where you add a stitch, and people were making some very basic treads on those, some raised treads. Mm-hmm. But then on moccasins, I've never seen anything that's equivalent. So again, that might be something that this distinction of groups. So this period I'm talking about, only those twine sandals had the really fancy raised treads, and then some of the slightly fancier other ones. And that would have, again, been part of this kind of ability to distinguish yourself socially. I can afford the twine sandals, the really hard to make specialized ones. Not everybody can. You can see that just in your footprint. But then again, once you get moccasins, that really smooths out that ability to distinguish yourself. Everybody has the same shoes, and it might have been more of a focus maybe on the community cohesion at that point in time. And I think people are living in these much larger villages. But then there's also, we see the kind of transition, or this switch to more to larger cotton textiles. Mm-hmm. So in big plazas at these big P4 sites, you wouldn't be able to see anybody's shoes really very well because they're big spaces. People would be wearing these cotton textiles you could see from further away. So, there might have been, again, still some way to distinguish yourself socially with your clothing, but it adapted to these new social venues, potentially.
Have you looked at the designs on those cotton textiles to see if you get any continuity in design motifs going from?
There definitely is some. Yeah. It's not across the board. It seems, there's new designs that are more conducive to being made on cotton textiles, but there is some overlap, and that definitely is something I would like to look at in the future.
Yeah. Well, Ben, we've got more questions than I've ever seen come in one of these, so we're not going to get to all of them. I'm so sorry, everyone, but I've got another question for you that you've been talking a lot of what you've been talking about. These are such prestige items. You make a really good argument for them being tied to regional identity, for people perhaps marking territory, or at least where they've been. The toe jogs up in the sort of confluence area is just incredible to me. Have you talked to descendant communities, Hopi, Pueblo people, anyone, about what all this means, and what have they said about the findings that you
That's a good question. That is definitely one shortfall of what I've been able to pull together. I did have plans. I was going to try to schedule some meetings with the Hopi and the Zuni in particular, and then some of these other Pueblos. Kind of fell through the cracks a little bit, and it was something I was going to try to add at the end of the study, and then COVID hit, and so we can't really. It's hard to schedule things with
with people not being able to be.
Especially
so let me ask a different question.
I'd like to, though. I just to say I plan to in the future. Let me add that before I get a bunch of.
And I know that Stuart was at your dissertation defense, Stuart Koyamtua, from the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office. So people are really aware of your work. Is a lot of folks asking questions on here were interested about polydactyly and the prevalence in Chaco and elite burials, but also just among Pueblo people altogether, or import given to people with polydactyly. What do we know about contemporary Pueblo attitudes towards that?
I don't know a lot about current Pueblo attitudes about polydactyly, but let's see. And like I said, Patty Crown, they did that really interesting study where they really were focusing on polydactyly. There's really only, I think, 8 cases or so of that showing up in burials. So I mean, it's not really common, but we know. So like the earliest burial in the northern burial cluster of Pueblo Bonito, that man had it, and then we know that it's a natural line of genetics. For several hundred years of other folks interred there. But around the world, or so let me back up, sorry, in Mesoamerica in particular, Lori Webster looked at this and basically people are not often depicted wearing shoes of any kind, but like in Mesoamerica, it's either the men, the kings, or royalty, I should say, and the gods that are shown with footwear. And then occasionally, some of those folks actually will be shown having 6-toe. And so there's this definitely a thought that they're special. And it was something that was not looked down upon. It was kind of enhanced or, given some prestige, if you will. But there's not a whole lot of information on that. And of course, there's the NAGPRA is a really important thing to think about. We're talking about human remains in general.
Right.
But then also just in terms of preservation, your foot bones and your finger bones are really the things that are most likely to get lost in after being interred for 1,000 years or so. So the data is difficult to get to. But we know that it is a trait that's in all different populations in the world. It still shows up. Actually, last year I was putting together this talk, and I was at the gas station, and the guy in front of me just happened to look down, and he had 7 toes on one foot. He was wearing sandals, and it was all I could do not to just like ask him about it. But I thought that would be kind of rude.
Do you have special shoes?
Yeah,
Well,
they look normal. They look just like normal flip-flops.
Well, we're just way over time. But
Yeah.
one last question. A lot
Okay.
of people are asking where they can read your dissertation. Is it available online anywhere? What would people search for?
Well, I just turned in the final draft just yesterday. I defended, like a month and a half ago. So it'll be available on ProQuest. And then there'll be a copy on TDAR as well. And then there'll be digital copies. I know that I'm going to basically most of the data will be curated at Edge of the Cedars.
Yeah.
So I'd say those are really the best ways. I really would like to turn into a book eventually, but just getting to that point now to start thinking about that. So hopefully in a couple years it'll be a book, but in the meantime, I'd say look at ProQuest, and it should be up there within the next couple weeks.
Yeah, so folks can look at just Google ProQuest or look at the University of Arizona's library site, and then TDAR, which is the Digital Archaeological Record, is at tdar.org.
Yeah.
All right, I want to thank you once again, Ben, for giving this excellent talk, and everybody who had great questions, but they didn't get answered. We'll actually give all these questions to Ben, so at least know that he'll be thinking about your questions. And please join us next week. Thanks once again, and have a great weekend.
Thanks a lot.
Good. Thanks, Ben. Talk to you later.